Good evening, and welcome to the first of the Department of Architecture lectures tonight. When I see photographs of Peter Zumthor's work, and I say photographs because I haven't seen the buildings, I'm deeply ambivalent. And I'm ambivalent because there's a certain rigor, for sure. There may be even a profundity, but they seem so out of time. And I think for me, it's a kind of condition where he seems to have. It's not going backwards. I don't want to say romantic or nostalgic. It's rather a kind of going forward, if it's possible, to a pre-urban condition, or going forward to an anti-urban condition that makes me uncomfortable. You know what I think of? I think of the so-called mystic minimalist musicians like Arvo Pärt, or someone who after becoming frustrated with Schoenberg and Shostakovich, tried to go forward by returning to very simple rhythms, single notes or triads, almost kind of monastic, again, anti-urban monastic chants. Not nostalgic, but to go forward to an anti-urban condition. And this, I think, is a radical conservatism. But I have a sense that after tonight, I know what it is. I know what it is. They fulfill, both the music and the buildings fulfill archaic human needs precisely at a time when we shouldn't have those needs. But my sense is that all this is going to be challenged tonight with our speaker, Peter Zumthor, right, with our speaker, Philippe Ursprung. Philippe did his doctoral work in art history and architecture at the Free University in Berlin. He's now professor at the University of Zurich. He will be moving soon this year to the ETH in Zurich, and we're very pleased because we have, with the GSD and the ETH, a relationship that we hope we can extend and reactivate and elaborate with Philippe. A lot of his work looks at relationships of art and architecture in different ways. Most of you know the CCA exhibition on Herzog and de Meuron called Natural History, and this kind of stunning catalog that came from that exhibition. There's also a book on Olafur Eliasson out maybe a year or so ago, and then a book on Alan Capro and Robert Smithson that I think is already in German, but will soon be coming out of University of California Press in English. So we're very pleased tonight to have Philippe Ursprung to challenge my ambivalence of Zumthor. Philippe.
Yeah, thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm very honored and pleased to be here. More than the legendary episode at the beginning of Marcel Proust's novel Remembrance of Things Past, when the narrator dips a Madeleine into a cup of tea and experiences a flashback to his childhood, I was always intrigued by another lesser-known episode at the end of the novel, namely the moment when the narrator gives way to an approaching carriage in a courtyard in Paris, steps back and stumbles against some unevenly placed paving stones. He remains there repeating the movement, one foot upon the higher flagstone, the other on the lower. He tries to figure out what this movement reminds him of, while the passers-by watch him with amusement. Eventually, he recalls the same sensation he had many years ago and is overwhelmed with happiness. Quote, "It was Venice." The occurrence in the courtyard evoked the feeling he had experienced as he, quote, "stood on two uneven stones in the baptistry of St. Mark's." Now what Proust here describes, the tactile sensation of the uneven ground under his slow-moving feet, is intrinsically connected to what Maurice Halbwachs described as spatial memory. And this spatial memory, I would argue, is a crucial component of the architectural experience. Peter Zumthor is among those architects who consider more than just the visual aspects of a project. For him, it is not only important how a facade looks, but how a floor, stair, or wall feel when one touches them with one's fingertips. How they smell, how they resonate, and what kind of associations, mental images, expectations, and memories they evoke. His buildings always revolve around the relationship between the human body and its environment, and the way the individual subject experiences very specific situations. This is a photo I took last week when I was in his studio in Haldenstein. We see him here working on the project Memorial in Memory of the victims of witch trials that he is doing together with the late Louise Bourgeois in Bardo, Norway. However, it took me some time to realize this. Until some years ago, I had the same image as Michael has, a very clear yet narrow image of his architecture. I had much respect for the beauty and atmospheric effects of his buildings. I admired the calm pace with which his small team, in the 90s it was 2, 3, 4 persons. Today it's 30 people working in the office in Haldenstein, Switzerland. How they produce projects uninterested in expansion and spending more inventive energy on seemingly marginal projects than many architects invest in skyscrapers. So, for example, the door that you see here took 1.5 years to develop. Nevertheless, I could not subscribe to Zumthor's idea of authenticity, his anachronistic conception of nature, and the romantic impulse that I felt pervaded his oeuvre. Although I had visited some of his projects, such as the protective housing for Roman ruins in Chur, his very first project, the famous thermal baths in Vals, and the museum in Bregenz, Austria, my image of his work was mainly influenced by photographs, especially those that you've already seen of the St. Benedict Chapel, built in 1987 in Zumwitz in the Swiss Alps, taken by the Swiss photographer Hans Danuser. So Danuser's interpretation, depicting the chapel in misty black and white photographs, had shaped my image of Zumthor as an earthbound architect working far from urban centers in the remoteness of an untouched landscape. And my view of Danuser was just as certain. I first encountered his work in 1989 in the exhibition In Vivo in Aarau, Switzerland. His grainy black and white images of cooling towers, laboratories, and dissecting tables were both fascinating and discomforting. In much the same way that they responded to Zumthor's architecture, skepticism colored my reaction to an artistic approach that seemed to me to be rooted in the neo-expressionism of the 80s and that favored an anti-modernism and pathos alien to my way of thinking. Then in early 2004, I went to visit St. Benedict Chapel. I walked through the tiny hamlet above Zumthor. A narrow gravel road leads up to the chapel. The effort of walking uphill, the crunching gravel under my shoes, the smell of fresh pines in the nearby forest, and the arrangement of the small buildings shaped my perspective. I was waiting for my mental image of a remote chapel hovering the sublime alpine landscape to materialize. Then suddenly the building appeared before me much smaller than expected. Instead of finding a desolate edifice tucked away in the Alps, merging with the landscape, I came face to face with one of the most elegant, fragile structures I've ever seen. Not since my first sight of Herzog and de Meuron's Eberswalde library had any new architecture made such a deep impression on me. The few narrow concrete steps that led to the door of the chapel felt not only firmer than the gravel road, but also more comfortable. After the ascent on the rough path, the steps to the chapel required no effort. My impression was not so much to ascend the steps, but to descend towards the chapel. My strenuous walking turned into a relaxed striding. My movements became more measured, more rhythmically structured, more focused. They became appropriate to the building, so to speak. And I remembered the episode by Marcel Proust. Almost automatically, my hand followed the thin metal handrail the way one holds onto a gangway before boarding a ship. I was now facing the door panel made from vertical wooden lath. It appeared lighter and more welcoming than the usual massive doors barring church entrances, but I had a brief moment of hesitation. Will the chapel be locked? Did I make the long journey in vain? Then the door swung open almost by itself. The unexpectedly long door handle, which increased the leverage and lay in the hand like a comfortable tool, facilitated the entry further. From the very beginning, I was already involved in the chapel's spatiality. I became part of a choreography of everyday movements and gestures. I was neither impressed nor dwarfed by the building. On the contrary, it made me pay attention because of its fragility. The details of the building subtly guided the way I moved and helped me become familiar with the environment. Later, Peter Zumthor told me that he always developed his spaces from a bodily experience and, quote, a feeling for the body, for a physical presence or a certain aura motivated the design process. As I entered the building, I felt as if I were putting on a coat. The moment of entry was not marked by a specific threshold, but by the sudden change of perception. My experience was discontinuous in the sense that the outside was incompatible with the inside. The process of transition resembled a series of cuts in a cinematic montage. The warmth and softness of the wooden floor under my shoes clearly differed from the coolness of the concrete steps. Inside the chapel, the smell of the wood was radically different from outside, where the scent of the forest mixed with the meadow. Because the floor seemed to be suspended, I felt like I was part of a resonant body, walking through some kind of huge instrument that echoed the noise of my footsteps. The light was unexpectedly bright. However, because there was no view to the outside, I was taken aback. While approaching the chapel, my movement had been linear, so to speak. Once inside, however, the teardrop-shaped floor plan directed my movement into a loop or spiral until I eventually sat down on one of the massive wooden benches. For Catholic believers, this was certainly the moment for prayer. For me, it became a moment of great attention, where the memories of my trip to the chapel, the transition from outside to inside, the various sensations, and the reflection on the side blurred. So my image of St. Benedict Chapel had changed. Or more precisely, I could no longer reduce the building to a mere image. I now perceived it as a narrative structure, almost like a movie. Instead of a misty phantasm dissolving into the surrounding landscape, I was facing a contemporary building. In fact, it was a building so up-to-date that it seemed to have been built just recently, not almost 20 years ago. So it's built in 87, early 88. I was there in 2004, so almost 20 years after. I was in a remote part of the Alps, yet this building did not subscribe to any local typological conventions. For example, it is built entirely of wood, not of stone, as every other Alpine chapel. Rather than relating to the local context and historical tradition, this chapel was in dialogue with the international cutting-edge architectural discourse. Several years before the notion of topological architecture appeared, Zumthor had designed a building that seemed to consist entirely of surfaces. These surfaces are superposed on each other, unfolding in layers and defining or performing a topological spatiality rather than a continuous spatiality. There was no such thing as a window that would have better articulated transition between inside and outside and would have been assigned for a more conventional spatial continuity. Instead, the roof seemed to be slightly lifted like the lid on a pot to let in some light. The wall, if one wants to call it like that, the uttermost layer covered with shingles that were pulled around the building like a textile membrane, spread apart only as far as necessary to give way to an opening that could hardly be defined as a door. Furthermore, the building was anything but earthbound. The few steps before the entrance seemed to hesitate before actually touching the chapel, as if a direct connection between the ground and the building would be impossible. The topography of the Alpine landscape and the topology of the architecture were incompatible and discontinuous. So I would argue that Zumthor's chapel anticipated much of the architectural debate of recent years. The topological designs inspired by the Möbius strip produced by architects such as UN Studio. Here is the Mercedes Museum in Stuttgart that opened 2 years ago, or here the Yokohama terminal by Foreign Office architects look, in comparison to Zumthor's much earlier solutions, like illustrations for a theoretical treatise. And even the landmark of the Swiss National Exhibition in 2002, Diller Scofidio's Blur building, which I regarded at the time as a groundbreaking exploration of atmospheric effects, now seemed to have been merely limping along behind the rhetoric of its own makers. Moreover, Zumthor's chapel was not, as I had feared, simply self-referential. On the contrary, it changed the way I perceived the surroundings and seemed to imbue the whole valley with a sense of movement. It was not about autonomy and isolation. Far from it, this design was about associations. The built structures sharpened my eye for the terrain as a whole, and it articulated the energy flowing through this region. And I do not mean this in the sense of esoteric energy lines. There's many people going in this area to find those lines. So it's not about those lines. It's about the institutional connections, for example, that still link the Catholic Church in this part of the Rhine Valley with the once mighty monastery of Disentis nearby. And even more important, in the sense of the generation of hydroelectric power that is crucial to this region. This Alpine landscape was also an industrial landscape, a landscape that was urban, entirely man-made. Henri Lefebvre's hypothesis of the complete urbanization, I thought, was correct. I was not on the periphery, but right at the heart of a network that extended to Berlin, New York, and Tokyo. Now, I'm not relating to this experience in order to emphasize my own subjectivity. My perception is part of a more general shift in perception that pervaded architecture in the 80s, but has only recently been conceptualized, namely the transition from the notion of architecture as a system of signs, as a text or language that can be read, to that of architecture as an image that affects the viewer and is experienced. We try to outline this shift in a book that appeared a couple of years ago, where we tried to introduce the notion of the image into the architectural discourse. Central to this trend that is today generally referred to as the pictorial turn or iconic turn is the role of photography. And in this process, the meeting between Danuser, the photographer, and Zumthor, the architect, becomes significant. So this revision of my view of Zumthor's architecture also made me take a closer look at Danuser's photograph. And it was only now that I realized that, of course, this photograph did not exist in isolation. It is part of a series of photographs that in my mind had run together into a single image. In response to a commission from Zumthor, Danuser had taken these photographs of a Hasselblatt of the newly constructed chapel in 1988. The result was a series of 6 square black and white photographs. They were first shown in exhibitions in Lucerne and Graz in 88 and then published in Du, Ottagono and Domus. So they were spread and they were perceived in the architectural world. Danuser had photographed different aspects of the interior and the exterior as though a single image could not do the chapel justice. So his interest was not, as I had thought, simply in evoking a certain atmosphere, but rather in addressing a much more fundamental issue, that is to say, making something invisible visible. So the series begins with a shot of the chapel and its surroundings. Now it's interesting to note that Danuser did not photograph the spectacular view over the Alpine valley of Surselva. This is the same moment, mid-1980s, Atelier 5 on your left and Mario Botta on your right. So typical architecture photography which would show the building and the view. But of course, this becomes so conventional that in a way the building cancels the view of the landscape and the landscape cancels the view on the building. So by deliberately turning his back on the view, Danuser managed to sidestep this Alpine cliché and in so doing drew attention to the surfaces and the textures and the specific materiality of this area. Another factor that was at odds with my mental image was that the chapel is not actually shrouded in banks of mist. In reality, the mist conceals rather what is behind it or beyond it. Consequently, it is not, as in Caspar David Friedrich's paintings of isolated Churchill, to just take this well-known example, part of another world, but rather something which is unsublime. The chapel looks like a foreign body that has landed there, smashed into the ground with the same brutality as the sharp-edged rocks that bespeak the destructive power of nature. At that time, many would still vividly have remembered the powder avalanche of February 1984 that had destroyed the original medieval chapel just 200 meters away. And the bell tower, if we want to call it like that, is equally unsettling. In my memory, it was something like a tree, but in reality, it looks more like a pylon for the cables and mountain railways that crisscross this area, an element that both connects and divides. In short, my romantic image of architecture that has become one with nature was right out of kilter with both Zumthor's architecture and Danuser's interpretation. My new view of Danuser's photography now gave me the impression that it is not about the aesthetic connection between the building and the landscape, but that it brings to light something that is generally overlooked, that is to say, the economic connection. If we take this shot of the fence that is almost touching the chapel with as something that is more than just picturesque. More interesting than this formal effect becomes what it tells us about the financial pressures that are ever present in this mountainous region and the pragmatic solutions that the locals came up with. Danuser avoids any hint of the nostalgic evocation of a supposedly intact pre-industrial world. He shows the viewer how these artifacts, the fence and the chapel, are made. The roughly worked branches rammed into the ground, supporting the cheap bark offcuts from a sawmill, are byproducts of the timber trade. So, in a way, he is helping us or making us to look at the chapel with the eye of the farmers, the joiners, the carpenters, and thus illuminates the work process, and with a photograph tells us more about Zumthor's architectural methods than any text that mentions that he was trained as a cabinet maker. This is a detail which basically only now is sort of made public. He tried to hide this fact in the 80s and early 90s. A similar subtle insight into the chapel's making is to be had from the details of the floor before and after the benches were installed. Although the boards are small and hence cheap, the variety and ornamental nature of the wood grain greatly enhances the chapel's interior. A shot of another detail looks like a technical commentary on the construction, showing how the load-bearing uprights are connected to the wall. Now, for me, this is highly significant in terms of spatial theory. It shows that for Zumthor, it is just not possible to think of a space other than as being defined by a sequence of textile planes, like a tent or a stage that achieves its effect by means of curtains and sets. These are all flat surfaces. Again, this would go into the hypothesis of a topological architecture avant la lettre. Now, how did Zumthor and Danuser make contact? In the early 80s, Danuser was already working his way from photography as an applied art to art photography. In 1984, he was the first photographer to be awarded an atelier grant by the city of Zurich that allowed him to go to New York. In 1985, he exhibited 3 series of photographs in Kunstmuseum Chur. Zumthor saw this exhibition and later decided to commission Danuser to take photographs of St. Benedetto. The two agreed that Danuser would have a free hand, and it was this encounter between Hans Danuser's photography and Peter Zumthor's architecture that was to instigate change in the portrayal of architecture in Switzerland and beyond. At the same time that Danuser's photographs were on view in Lucerne, the Architecture Museum in Basel was showing the exhibition Architektur Denkform, Architecture as a Way of Thinking, by Jacques Herzog and Pierre Demeuron. So this is their first exhibition that was perceived. And they confronted the problem of representation of architecture by covering the glass walls, the big windows of this modernist building by very large translucent photographs of their own projects. So one could sort of see outside, but only filtered through these grainy depictions of their project, which were like phantoms, part of the building. And then in 1991, so 3 years later, they participated in the Architecture Biennale in Venice by showing photographs of their building shot by 4 different artists. And this was the beginning of their collaboration with Thomas Ruff, who would remain up to the present day a close colleague. Here you see a shot taken at the exhibition Natural History at the CCA in 2002 with on the wall this image by Thomas Ruff, which shows their storage hall, Ricola Laufen. So this is a brief period and has a particular place, I would say, in the history of the relationship between photography and architecture. one could argue that it has something in common with the late 20s, when Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona pavilion for the World Exhibition of 29 was photographed. It was dismantled again after the exhibition, and as though the pavilion had been built just for the camera, and was only through photography that it became an icon of modern architecture. After 2000, the onset of signature architecture marked the end of this period during which architecture and art/photography converged so productively. Although many artists have actively engaged with architecture these days, aside from exceptions such as Hélène Binet, architectural photography is once again a propaganda tool and not an instrument of critical reflection. In the meantime, perhaps video or video installation has established itself as a useful means to represent architecture. And I just want to show this image from Peter Zumthor's exhibition in Bregenz, 2007, where he tried to represent his architecture by video installations by the Austrian artist Sixt Petric. In my view, a very good way a very adequate way to represent architecture, which has not been distributed because there's no catalog, for example, so this exhibition has happened almost unnoticed. So once again, why did Zumthor choose Danuser to portray his first buildings? In order to shed additional light on his choice, I would like to take a look at Danuser's exhibition in Chur. It arose from a project dating back to 1980 that was known by the title Economy, Industry, Science and Research. On view in Chur were shots from the series Atomic Energy, Gold and Medicine. The photographs were taken in sites such as Los Alamos, New Jersey, Switzerland, France and Germany. The themes were, among others, genetic engineering, atomic energy, production of gold. So it was became clear to me that Danuser's approach was not primarily expressive, that for him the creation of an atmosphere and the evocation of the uncanny were less important than analysis, but not only analysis of an object, but above all of the way that the public perceived these issues in those days. So I find it interesting that Danuser does not deny the pathos, he does not deny emotion, he even nurtures it in the viewer. So he's not about to deconstruct the emotion, he's not about to, like what Alan Sekula, to give a contemporary example from a different approach would do, who tries to desublimate and deconstruct this emotionality. He tries to maintain it, but he does not try to evoke the numinous as such as, for example, James Welling would do. So Danuser's aim was not to identify his shots with particular places as a documentary photographer would do, but rather to represent general types. He showed how human beings penetrated the very heart of matter, the innermost workings of the mechanisms of life, how they seek to control and manipulate the forces of nature. His work was about centers of power that elude representation, places that were inaccessible, invisible to the public, yet preoccupied the collective imagination in those days. So, for example, the issue of nuclear power was, I would say, one of the main debates of the decade, but there was no image from the inside. So he went there. Of course, there was nothing to see, but it's about this dilemma that his photographs are. Today we would call these themes biopolitics or biopower, the term that Foucault coins in the 70s, but nobody uses until now. So that would be an answer why Zumthor is attracted by Danuser's approach. On the one hand, his own designs are based on images, that is to say, his intention is to give three-dimensional expression to particular mental images that he has with him. He must have been fascinated by the fact that Danuser concentrated almost exclusively on interiors, and he may have felt an affinity here with his own design methods that always work out from the inside and it assumes an element of discontinuity. In other words, it assumes it is impossible for the interior to fully correspond to the exterior. But most importantly, it seems to me his own work, like that of Danusa, is about articulating latent processes, about envisioning the invisible. This is very clear, for example, in his first project called Protective Housing for Roman Archaeological Excavations in Chur, built in 86, where the architectural shell not only echoes the contours of long-gone Roman houses, it also directs the viewer's gaze to the scarcely visible remnants of a lost civilization. In a way, there's nothing to see there. It's the traces of a civilization which was at this site, which has gone, and which is evoked like a phantom, but the actual remnants are there, but they're also not there. So in Saint Benedict, this invisible, one could argue, is the religious faith that architects, painters, and sculptors have sought to portray ever since antiquity. But more interesting in my view, it is also the complex historical, economical, and social makeup of the whole region of Surselva, a topic that has often been forgotten or repressed by the cliché of the intact mountain area. So comparing the images of Saint Benedict and the works shown in Danusa's exhibition, one cannot help but be struck by the similarity by the first picture of the chapel and the image of the nuclear power station. The exhibition opens with shots taken in and above a cooling tower. Now, while the silhouettes of cooling towers are familiar, almost emblematic, the interior of these towers defy representation. The dark space, only dimly lit from above, is filled with swaths of mist. Were it not for the sloping concrete columns, one might easily take this for a cathedral. So this shot of the dark interior, in a way, matches the shots of the pale upper edge of the cooling tower that show the thin concrete wall cloaked in mist. And in the same vein, one might easily imagine this shot were taken from a viewing platform in the Alps or from a crest of a dam. So the natural phenomenon of the mist mingles with industrially produced steam, the invisible threat inherent in technology, and we should recall that the explosion of the reactor at Chernobyl in the Soviet Union happened on 26 April 1986 and drastically demonstrated the deadly danger of nuclear power and the fact that this danger was totally invisible. So everybody at that time was obsessed by this invisible danger. Were we allowed to eat fruit? What is okay if you would play outside? What happened? Because you could not see it. It was all invisible. So this threat, this fear counters the atmospheric beauty of the, of course, harmless water vapor. So once again, I would like to look at the past. In the 50s, the construction of hydroelectric power stations in Grisons heralded a period of rapid economic growth. The energy industry and the tourist industry drove the region's upsurge, and many mountain communities, including Vals, where now is this famous bath by Peter Zumthor, were villages struck by extreme poverty. So everybody would move because there was absolutely no labor. They were at the very edge of financial collapse. So these villages, this whole area, owe their prosperity to these power stations, that is to say, to the construction of large-scale complexes and the payments made for the waters they used. Since the 50s, the Nordostschweizerische Kraftwerke AG, NOK, has been the main player in these developments. The company planned to construct one of Switzerland's largest power station systems in the Surselva, with 7 reservoirs, 140 kilometers of tunnels, 8 operating stations, and an output of 2,000 gigawatt hours. It is almost a quarter of an atomic energy plant. Although these plans were not totally realized, the region was fundamentally affected. The hydroelectric power stations built between the 60s and 80s, with its complex system of reservoirs, tunnels, etc., literally plowed up the mountain landscape around Zumwitz. So this region is now inextricably connected with the factories and transportation routes in the heavily populated areas of Switzerland heartlands. The nuclear power stations run by NOK, they were started in 79 and 84, are connected with numerous pumping stations in the Alps. And that's sort of the trick. Cheap energy is used to pump water up into the reservoirs, where it is turned into expensive energy. So the atomic energy is cheap, the water energy is expensive and can be sold all over Europe into these networks. Although, in contrast to the cooling towers of the nuclear power stations that are clearly visible, the infrastructure in the Alps is almost invisible and suppressed in the tourist's perception. Even if we see it, we cannot see it because we're in the Alps. So this problem started to attract attention in the late 70s when the public mobilized to protest against NOK's new proposal to create a new reservoir that would flood the Greiner plain. This is a particularly nice alpine valley, very remote. There was a conflict which dragged on for over a decade, and in 1986, NOK finally yielded to public and political pressure and abandoned its plans. Subsequently, the parish of Zumwitz, which includes the Greiner in its terrains, these are very, very large villages. There's 50 people living, but they're enormous terrains, and because it's basically just mountain area. So includes this Greiner, was deemed to have been disadvantaged by the loss of potential earnings from water rights. They would have made a lot of money with this dam because it's all on their territory. And they received a symbolic payment from donations. There was a national referendum in 92, and then there was a law which in Switzerland is called the Landschaftsrappen, the landscape penny. And since 1995, financial compensation for preserving the landscape by non-exploitation is instituted throughout the country. So Zumwitz, where Zumthor's chapel stands, receives $500,000 per year for not having a dam. So it could be said, of course I'm exaggerating, but I would just like to state that there is an economic connection between the photographs Danuser took in the nuclear power station in Gösgen in 1981 and the shots he took in 1988 of St. Benedict. Both reflect burning issues in the 80s, the politics of the nation's energy supply. The fragile chapel in the mountains, with the potential for destruction, albeit themselves already partially destroyed by industry, stands in stark contrast to the rawness of the power station in the heartlands. And yet the former is dependent on the latter, for we can assume that without the profits created by the energy industry and without the output from nuclear power stations, politicians would not have been in the position to halt the construction of additional hydroelectric plants in the mountains, and hence to preserve the illusion of a domesticated nature that is so important for the tourist industry. Now, neither Zumthor nor Danuser allude to the connection between the chapel and the energy debate, although both were probably aware of this. They had close links with the region. Danuser's family stems from this area, and Zumthor, who had been trained in Basel and New York, lived there since the 70s. During the 70s, when he was working for the Cantonal Department of Historic Monuments, so his office only opens in 79, so he was 10 years working in the Department of Historic Preservation, he encountered the dialectics of modernization and destruction firsthand and knew from his daily work the extent of the upheaval in the landscape that was happening at that time. So this is another image of this protective housing in Chur, where you see just behind this is this wooden shell, and here is part of this urbanization of the Alps that takes place in the 70s, and it seems like this door must not touch this terrain because there is no way to represent these different strata, the history of Roman architecture, what's happening here, on one level of representation. And that's, I think, why he needs 1.5 years to construct a door, because it's theoretically not possible. So let me conclude. It is interesting to note that Zumthor's most recent project, which is currently under construction, again deals with the relation between industrial change and landscapes and makes visible the invisible. Way up in Norway, commissioned by the state, who currently intends to develop the country's road system for the tourism industry, he is building a zinc mine museum in Sauda, on a territory that is literally undermined by a system of tunnels that are defunct since the late 19th century. He's building a museum in form of a path that will allow the visitors to experience the interrelation between industrial history, the beauty of the landscape, and contemporary architecture. This is a photograph of the late 19th century, and this is how the museum will look. Unlike today, where these relations can be theorized, I would argue that the connection between cutting-edge architecture in an apparently intact landscape and nuclear power could, in the late 80s, only be demonstrated through the medium of photography, or rather through photography that was overtly artistic. Danuser went far beyond reportage photography when he chose to address the problem of the invisible rather than succumbing to the cooling tower cliché. He could have taken just images of cooling towers like most photographers were doing at the time. And he abandoned the conventions of architectural photography when he chose not merely to illustrate his subject matter but also to interpret. He developed a perspective which allows us, at least from now back, to connect seemingly disparate factors. And it was possible to make this connection because for a short while the barriers between different genres had been lowered and the photographs became the common denominator. For one moment, architecture, uncertain of its role in society and striving to escape the isolation of its ivory tower, put its trust in the mediating powers of photography. And photography, on the way to artistic autonomy, where it has now arrived, was enjoying a new freedom that allowed it to use images to make connections that could not be expressed in words. So in terms of cultural history, this chance constellation was very fortuitous, and in terms of Marcel Proust, it is always important to work and take time to reconstruct the past and relate it to the present. Thank you for your attention. Yeah.
I think your photographing photography is really apt in this case. Particularly because some of the things we've been talking about today, maintain this of lightness rather than just authenticity, which is the way images work is usually discussed. For instance, when I look at your work, I'm reminded of this sort of misreading, which you have to be critical to. I'm reminded of this misreading of minimalism. So much that it's not about the sort of stupidity of the dumb object as much as it's about something that attained a kind of spiritual dimension or something, say in the work of someone like James Turrell, where maybe you have a work that looks like a kind of prehistoric ruin. Or if we're talking about in music, Arvo Pärt, it sounds like a kind of monastic chant. But I think the whole pleasure in the work is in that likeness, and I think that relationship of likeness is the relationship of the photograph. And so I think that's sort of the perfect place to sort of locate the appeal of Zumthor's work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
This is a question I guess about the relationship that you're projecting between, that you're discerning between, say, a lived experience of time, a human experience of time, and on the other hand, a historical time, whether it's institutional, like the Catholic Church, or economic, as in the hydroelectric developments, a larger span of time or temporality that can't actually be experienced. And it seems in kind of projecting through into your conclusion that the diagnosis is in, at least in Zumthor's architecture, either an incapacity or a decision not to participate in historical time. That the evocation you get, particularly of the chapel, convincingly demonstrates the participation in lived experience, in the kind of in a what I'm calling a human time. But it seemed that it's the photography, in particular, in your instance here, but also maybe in the case of the framing of the Roman ruins, that architecture is really reinforcing its own distance from historical time. And is that erroneous and as a diagnosis on my part, or is there a kind of dissonance that's really being structured here between those two temporalities, which I think would relate again to the Proust, which in one reading is precisely about the incompatibility or the incommensurability of lived human experiential time and historical time.
Yeah, none of this is made explicit. I mean, I'm arguing that Zumthor, when he writes, he would never write about that. Yeah. It's probably also wise, because the cliché of the Alpine Yeti worked well and sold well for a while, so why change it? And yes, I would say that as a person who is a large part of his career, he has to deal with the fact that cultural heritage is destroyed rapidly. So he spends 10 years in drawing villages and conserving images, conserving plans of villages which are very rapidly destroyed and change. So if he is nostalgic or not, we don't even have to decide. I think I don't even care. Also, I say, because the intention it's not so important for me. But I'm sure that this historic temporality is always around, and he must be aware of that. He's not historicist, so he's not. Let's say in a sense like Peter Eisenman would be interested in how does his architecture relate to Palladio or to Terrania or whatever. So he does not relate to architectural history as a horizon, like Herzog and Zimmermann don't. So this is sort of a different way of dealing with history. I would say that he looks at history as something which is inseparable from personal experience. And where the smell and the movement and the memories and the misunderstandings are always part, which in a way we can never reconstruct, like Proust. But we can produce a texture which allows us to travel on this area. So for me the clue is where it becomes evident is the discontinuities that's always there. There cannot be a window. It's impossible theoretically to make a window or a door because there is no continuity. And this, I think, is something which is very, very contemporary. Nobody in 1950 could have, the problem was not there. And I think that this continuity of time and space, which starts to break apart in the early 70s, if one looks at the theory like Lyotard or the topological discussions or the Mille Plateaux, there's various voices discuss this rupture and the impossibility to sort of keep a time-space continuity together, is articulated not in words, not at all in words, because I think his writing are almost useless. I only quote him for parts of the interviews, but not his writing, because I think it's talking about something totally different. But in the work it's there, but one could not see it at that time, because first there was not the notion for it, and then nobody transported it. And we perceive architecture, at least me, at least 50% or even more, probably 80 or 90% via photography. So I don't even know how to separate the perception of photography or reality. Just in the case of Benedict, I had to go there to see that my image was too narrow.
What I like very much on the image is also that you showed the photos, and the photos are almost like a dictionary to get close to both, to the architecture and to the landscape. Because I know this landscape very well, and the Plaundal-Greiner you only understand actually with this mood of this black and white, and with the fog and with the mist, and not the beautiful Swiss landscape what we usually see as cliché. And I think the pictures actually open a totally different way to look at architecture and the context of the landscape. And I think that was also fantastic on the exhibition in Bregenzer Kunsthaus, on the films, on this very slowly moving. So I think for architects to show their work, or to express their work, and to get the people to look in the right way, that is actually almost like a task we need to do. You know, what sort of how do we educate that people look different? Well, I think that therefore the photos are fantastic.
Yeah, and thanks you a lot. And I think this is an interesting case where he totally delegates this. Of course, they didn't work together afterwards. That often happens not only in Switzerland, but particularly in Switzerland. So it's just like a one encounter and then not again. But the architect understands that he has not the means to alone represent. He tried to. He had his drawings in the catalogue, which I think do not work in the same way. And he tried to talk about music also, which is too complex, at least for me, to really follow in this relation. So the photos were at the right place at the right moment. Yeah. And I think the video was also an excellent choice.
Yeah, I'm convinced about the argument that you made regarding the photos of the chapel and how they embed his building into a larger matrix of social economic forces. But I'm not convinced that Zumthor's collaboration with this photographer over time has actually changed his work. Do you think it has, and how?
No, it does not change the work, no. It has probably influenced the way he presented his work. I mean, I think this is like late 80s, so that is the very beginning of a certain boom of Swiss architecture and sort of style, black and white, earnest, and he very much remained on that track of the atmospheric and of this sort of earnestness and of the autonomy and isolation. But I wouldn't go so far to say that this was because of the photographer. I mean, he chose the photographer, he controlled it entirely. Of course, he was free to do what he wanted, but in the end, the architect would have been free not to show the pictures. So it serves him at that moment, and then he does not repeat it. He does not use him for Valls. Actually, he has no solution for Valls, nor for the most recent project. So there has been no adequate form of representation for Cologne, for Bruder Klaus, except for this video installation, but this does not go for magazines. So it's everything is on hold. And Danuser, sort of commissioned by someone else, photographed the Therme of Alps in the late 90s, but this was sort of not authorized by Zumthor.
Philip, I'm still wondering about your argument in general. Are you giving a reading of Danuser, or are you giving a reading of Zumthor, or is this just Philip Ursprung looking at images or looking at architecture? Because I have my doubts, especially about Zumthor.
I'm a historian, so I have to tell stories and find out about historical forces and relationships, and the intention of these people I do not is not so important.
Yeah,
for
you mentioned
I want
that
to
you don't
understand
use the text,
why
but
certain things come together at a certain moment, how these things relate, which are not talked about and are not part of the picture normally. So I don't believe in an autonomous history of architecture, and I don't believe in autonomous history of photography, and I don't believe that one can isolate this like you can on a table where you cut little pieces. So I believe that the history is rather a mess, and I try to make sense out of that mess. So of course that's why I use the word I very often. I want to be localized as someone who speculates, so that someone else can say, okay, this is okay, but here you're wrong, so that the argument can go further, because I do not want to hide between the mist of St. Benedict Chapel, so I don't want to sort of have a cloud in front of my argument, because I'm not artist, not architect, and that doesn't help me at the moment. So that's why I put myself a little bit too much into the picture.
No, that was not a critique. I think you made a very good, clear statement about what is today's role of a critique of a critic in architecture, in the sense of not repeating the arguments that are already out there, but giving a new reading.
Yeah, I of course I don't have to sell the product also.
Exactly.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you.